Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Dick Swaab. He's an internationally renowned researcher in neuroscience who received numerous awards and published over 540 scientific papers. He earned his medical and doctoral degrees at the University of Amsterdam and served as director of the Netherlands Institute for Neuroscience for 27 years. In 1985, Professor Swaab founded the Netherlands Brain Bank, which supplies the international research community with clinical and neuropathological brain tissue. He is also Emeritus Professor at the University of Amsterdam and Professor at Zhejiang. I'm sorry for the pronouncement here, but I really don't speak Chinese. University at Zhou, China, since 2007. His major research interest focuses on brain development, sexual differentiation, Alzheimer's disease, the neurobiological basis of depression and eating disorders. In 2008, Professor Swaab received the Academy Medal for his significant role in national and international neuroscience, and is also the author of several books. So, Dr. Swaab, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's an honor to everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So, today we're going to focus our conversation on the development, let's say, of gender identity and sexual orientation in humans, primarily. So, this is a very complex and delicate subject. So, I think that we should move along the path carefully here. But the first question I would like to ask you is, in humans, are there already any well-established brain areas that are sexually dimorphic?
Yes, and we have found the first sexual dimorphic nucleus in the hypothalamus, and that was in 85. And since then, there are many reports on sexually dimorphic brain areas. And that goes all over the brain in size of structures, in connectivity, in cell numbers, in the presence of sex hormone receptors, in differences in peptides and other transmitters. So you name it, and there are sexually dimorphic aspects in the human brain.
Mm-hmm. But this was already found in humans, right? I'm asking you this because at least before or until recently, most of this type of research was done in animal models, correct?
Yes, yeah. And we have learned a lot about sexual orientation and the programming of the brain from animal models, but we don't have an animal model for gender identity. So you cannot ask an animal, do you feel male or female? And we don't have a test for that. But what came out animal research was that sex hormones are programming the brain in very early development. And programming means that you make structural differences according to the sex hormone levels in a critical period. And after that period, the structural difference is present, but the functional differences only appear when the sex hormones go up in puberty. So you have a phase of programming and a phase of activating structures that are already set there in the brain for a long time. And this principle also seems to hold for gender identity if you look to the human brain.
So there are organizational and activational effects during development due to these sex hormones, right?
Yes, and probably not only due to sex hormones, but also due to direct genetic influences. But sex hormones are very important.
So you mentioned a critical period. When in development, when is the earliest phase in development where we can already find some sexual dimorphism in the brain? Does it start prenatally?
Well, the problem is that the organizational type of action of sex hormones does not result in overt changes in early development. So the structural changes only occur together with the functional changes. But we can reason that both sexual orientation and gender identity are programmed in the brain, in the human brain, before birth. And then in puberty, the structures are activated, although even earlier you can see from, for instance, from playing behavior, sex differences between boys and girls. And in the 60s, it was always claimed that this was due to the behavior of the parents, because the parents would encourage boys to play with cars and encourage girls to play with dolls.
Yes.
But we didn't believe that because of the animal experimental work. And so we had both a boy and a girl. And we have systematically given them cars and dolls, and the girl only was interested in the dolls and the boy only in the cars. But 2 children is not enough for a good publication. So we were very happy with Alexander and Heinz, who did the same thing with monkeys. And there again, it appeared that the young female monkeys were interested in dolls, and the male monkeys looked what you could do with a car. And you cannot hold that this is under the pressure of the monkey father and mother. So it's an old mechanism that has shown his advantages during evolution.
Mm-hmm. So we can say that it has also been traced phylogenetically to other
Yes.
species that are
Yes.
related to us.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and after birth, isn't there a period during the first few years of life where there is also some sexual differentiation occurring in the brain, or am I wrong?
Well, we don't have any evidence that you can influence either gender identity or sexual orientation after birth by the social environment.
Mm-hmm.
So to give you an example, there's a famous case of a little boy that was born with a small problem. That was the opening of the foreskin of the penis was not large enough.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to remove the foreskin of the penis. That happened in Canada in an operating theater, and they made a mistake with the equipment, and instead of burning a little bleeding blood vessel, they burnt away the whole penis. And this was in the 70s, when people still thought that it was the social environment that was pushing the child into the male or female direction. And so it was decided to make a girl out of this little boy. And he got, or she got psychological guidance from John Money in Philadelphia. And she got dressed as a girl, and she had dolls to play with that she hated. But in puberty, she even got female sex hormones, estrogens.
Yeah.
But I think 30 years ago, there was a meeting in the United States, and I said, well, this is the only example I know that has been published that you can change gender identity after birth. And then Milton Diamond stood up and said, he is a sexologist in America, and he said the whole story of it is not true, because I know the person, and he changed back when he was away from parents and doctors into a man again. And he married, they adopted children, and he has described into detail his whole story. So this shows that whatever you do after birth You can remove the penis, you can have psychological guidance, you can give girl-like toys, and you can give estrogens in puberty. You don't change gender identity. He still was feeling to be a male. This is to show how potent that the programming of the brain is in early development. And the same can be said for sexual orientation. We know, for instance, that the same-sex parents that adopted children from babyhood onwards, that those children are doing fine. They perform very well psychologically, but they don't have a higher prevalence for homosexuality, although both parents are very good examples for them. So there is no social impact on gender identity or sexual orientation.
So can we say that both gender identity and sexual orientation are innate aspects of human psychology, and that they are genetically programmed in some way?
Well, they are part of our character. They are programmed, but only partly genetically.
Okay.
In the womb, of course, you have also a period in which, on top of genetic background, there are influences. And those influences can be, for instance, differences in hormone levels, can be chemicals given by doctors, phenobarbital, difantobin, that was given for epileptic women also during pregnancy. Those compounds are changing metabolism of sex hormones. So then you have a high risk, for instance, for transsexualism of the child. And we are wondering whether compounds in the environment that interfere in the interaction between sex hormones and developing brain cells might also have the influence. Research there is really necessary.
Yes, and I think that you were talking before about the case of David Reimer, right?
Yes.
That was a boy that was born with an intersex condition, and I think...
No. He was not born with an intersex condition. He was
okay.
born with a small opening of the foreskin of the penis.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was a normal boy, only this opening. And then you get problems with urination, and later you get problems with kidney function. So you have to remove the foreskin of the penis. No, it was not intersex.
Okay.
But there are many cases of intersex that also give information about this period of programming.
Yes. I mean, intersex conditions maybe can inform us because genitalia in this case develops apart from what happens in the brain, and so that's one of the reasons why gender identity might not match, at least in some cases, the body, how the body develops in terms of male or female, right?
Yeah, the point is that our sex organs are developing in the first few months of pregnancy, and sexual differentiation of the brain takes place in the second half of pregnancy, under the influence of a peak in testosterone in boys and a lack of this peak in testosterone in girls. So those two processes can be influenced in a differential way. And concerning intersex, it was always said it's important to give clarity to both the parents and the child from the beginning onwards. So you should do an operation as soon as possible, and then the social environment will push the child into the direction that was chosen. And since it's easier to make a girl than a boy out of an intersex condition, usually those kids were becoming girls. But we know from patient societies that many mistakes have been made because the brain was differentiating in a different direction than the sex organ.
So we've been referring many times about sex hormones and the effects that they have on the brain. Prenatally, what are some of the main hormones we're talking about? Are we talking about, for example, testosterone, estrogen, and others like that?
Yeah, for human sexual differentiation of the brain, testosterone is the main factor.
Okay.
And in order to illustrate that, I can mention a condition that's called complete androgen insensitivity syndrome.
Hmm.
So those people are genetically male, so they are XY, but they feel that they are heterosexual women.
Hmm.
And that is because the receptor, the DNA for the receptor of testosterone has a mutation. So the receptor is not sensitive to testosterone anymore. And that means that both the body and the brain are not sensitive to testosterone, although it's produced in high amounts. And then they differentiate into the female direction. So this shows very clearly that it's testosterone for human beings that is the most important factor.
Hmm.
And that
So,
is an important difference between rodents and human beings. So most research is done on rodents, on rats and mice. And there the male brain is differentiating on basis of testosterone again, but first testosterone has to be aromatized to estrogens. And it's estrogen that differentiates the brain in mice and rats into the male direction. That's not the case in human beings. For human beings, it's direct effect of testosterone. And that also shows that you should be very careful with extrapolating animal experimental data to humans.
mhm. And these kinds of conditions, like the one you mentioned, where the receptors in the brain are insensitive to testosterone, there are others, like, for example, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, that usually leads to women that develop into what we can call tomboys, right,
Yeah.
or something like that.
Yeah.
So, through these kinds of conditions, we can also acquire more knowledge about the nature of the development of gender identity and sexual orientation, correct?
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm. Right, right.
And that
So,
also shows that it can be influenced on many levels of the cascade, of the molecular cascade. And this is shown by mutations.
mhm. Okay. So, if I were to ask you what are some of the most well established areas of the brain that are associated with gender identity, what would those be?
Well, I think the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, that was, it's an area that's important for sexual behavior. And we found that in males it's twice as big as in females. It has in males much more synapses coming from other brain areas that are important for sexual behavior, like the amygdala. And what we found was that in transsexuals, this sex difference is reversed. So in male to female transsexuals, the size and cell number is female, and in a male and in a female to male transsexual, the size and cell number is male. So that's a reversal of the properties of a brain area that is matching with their gender identity, the way they conceive themselves. And it's not matching with the birth certificate and passport. And since we cannot change the brain, we have to change the birth certificate and passport.
Mhm. Yes. So, just for the audience, could you try to tell us where more or less this bed nucleus of the stria terminalis is located in the brain?
Well, it's on top of the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is an important structure for reproduction,
Yes.
and it's just below the lateral ventricles, which are the cerebrospinal fluid containing spaces in the brain.
Right. And aren't there also areas in the hypothalamus itself that are associated with gender identity or sexual orientation?
Yes, there are other areas. For instance, the infundibular nucleus. We found that area that is very important for instance, for the menstrual cycle of women, for reproduction. We found that that one is larger in females than in males. And in transsexuals, this difference is also reversed. So again, it shows brain structures that are in agreement with the feelings of people. And for sexual orientation, the first one we found was the suprachiasmatic nucleus. That's the biological clock, which is larger, twice as large in homosexual men as it is in heterosexual men. Levey has found a structure, it's called the interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus number 3, that is smaller in homosexual men than in heterosexual men. But we found this also being related to gender identity. So it's not only related to sexual orientation. And so there are stories for different structures in different parts of the brain.
And they also are associated with slightly different functions, correct?
Yes, yes, as far as we know, because as I said, it's very difficult to have an animal model for gender identity.
Yes, yes, I understand. And are there any cortical areas of the brain that are sexually dimorphic, for example? Because we've been focusing mostly on subcortical areas, right? Like the
Yeah.
hypothalamus and the stria terminalis. So are there also cortical areas of the brain that are sexually dimorphic?
Yes, for instance, Daphne Joel from Israel has shown that by imaging techniques. I must say that the differences in cortical areas are not as large as the differences we found in subcortical areas.
Yeah.
And in that respect, it's important to say that there is variability in all our properties. And also in our properties related to gender identity and sexual orientation. And if you look in one person in different brain areas, you find that it can be in a cortical area more female, but in a subcortical area more male. And it can be just somewhere between the male and female extremes. And the variability is probably, but we don't know that yet, is probably related to some properties. But the principle is that the variability is large, and the variability we find in all our properties, and the variability was the motor of the evolution. So in changing conditions, there were always people that could adapt because they had some variability that was giving them some favor in this new condition. In my opinion, the evolution of the brain and of us as human beings has stopped, but we have still the variability. And as Milton Diamond always said, nature loves variability, because that was the basis of evolution, but society hates it. So if you are at the extremes of the variability, then you have a problem, because society only accepts you if you are somewhere in the middle with the big group. But if you are an extreme in one way or the other, you have a problem. And that gives an emotional load to everything that we just discussed.
So this kind of variability that you are talking about Are you referring to the fact that because there are all of these factors around, like for example, the presence and the levels of sex hormones during prenatal development, and then also the size and the organization of several different areas of the brain, and the fact that they might have different types of receptors and different numbers of receptors for different sex hormones? That is basically the reason why people can vary a lot in terms of their sex characteristics and their gender identity, their sexual orientation, right?
Yeah, you can add to all those factors that you correctly mentioned, you can add self-organization of the brain, because the brain is so complex that you cannot program brain development into detail. And the solution for that is that the brain is looking for the best contacts during brain development. And that's a principle of self-organization that you find in all complex systems. And self-organization, by the immense numbers of the contacts, makes every brain different. And I always give as an example a Siamese twin in America that is still living. They have two heads, but they have one body. And the interesting thing, if you look to the Hansel twin on the internet, is that they say at the end of the movie, we are two totally different persons. So if they are genetically the same, they were staying in the same environment, they have experienced everything the same from conception onwards, and yet they are totally different persons. So self-organization is very important, and that also explains that if you look to identical twins, that it's not like if one is homosexual, the other will also be homosexual. If one is heterosexual, the other one can be homosexual, etc. It's self-organization is an important point.
And you are probably referring also to stochastic events during brain development that occur, and things even after birth, things like brain pruning, or how do you call it? I think it is. I'm forgetting the name of the cell now, but neural pruning and things like that, right?
But again, I don't think that postnatal pruning is important for our gender identity or sexual orientation. That has been established earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. So when there's a mismatch between what we could call the biological sex and gender identity, is it always a case of gender dysphoria or not?
Now it's accepted that transsexuality occurs. We get more and more people that are not wanting to change their gender identity because they are somewhere in the middle between male and female, and they can be happy with that. So every year there's a person coming to me, to my office, and he said, well, this year I will change my sex. He is now 67, and I wonder whether it will ever happen. So there are people that are in the middle, and they are always in doubt whether they are male or female, but they can be happy with that. And some people want to get rid of their breasts, other people only want to cross-dress. So it's very individual because of the huge variability we have in this aspect also.
Mm-hmm. Right. So another question. We've already established that there are areas of the brain that have been identified as sexually dimorphic. But could we say, or could we talk about a female and a male typical brain or not?
Well, you can, on basis of statistics, you can say, well, the typical brain at the extremes, male or female, is defined in this and that way. But again, the variability in all the aspects in different brain areas is huge. And therefore, Daphne and Joel has come with the mosaic concept. So we have all sex differences, but they differ in size, in location, etc. And it's a mosaic that is different for every person.
Mm-hmm. So this is the so-called mosaic hypothesis, right?
Yes, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that again has to do with the fact that we've already talked about, that we've been finding that there are many more factors behind sexual differentiation and sexual development than we thought before, because before people thought that it was only a matter perhaps of the levels of sex hormones present at different stages of development, prenatally or something like that. But now we know that there are many more internal and external factors.
Right, yeah. And then it depends on the moment that a group of cells somewhere in the brain has a critical period in which they are sensitive to all those factors. And that is different for each brain area. And within a brain area, it's different for each cell type. So cells are influenced in a differential way according to the moment that they are sensitive to those factors. And that's also a factor adding up to the variability.
Mm-hmm. Do you know what is the earliest stage where a child, for example, can already tell that she has a gender identity that is different from her own physical or biological sex, let's say?
Well, children sometimes very early start to cross-dress. Boys want to dress up with the dress of their sister, or they walk on the shoes of the mother, and they come to the polyclinics here. In most cases, this is not a prediction for gender identity problems, but it is a prediction for homosexuality.
Okay.
The youngest child that was very convinced that he was born in the wrong body was Manon at the age of 2, quite young. Usually it's around the age of 5 that children are very convinced that they are not in the right body. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, they have to wait until 18 until they can be operated. But in the meantime, you can postpone puberty. And the advantage of that is that then the boy is not growing out to a man of nearly 2 meters before he can be operated, because that would be made it very difficult to make an attractive girl from that. And so the postponement of puberty is important and has shown to be safe.
Mm-hmm. But that is only done in very specific cases, right? Because as you were saying, most of the children that express some sort of gender identity that is not congruent with their biological sex move on to find later on that they are homosexual, right?
Right, yeah, right.
Mm-hmm. So this has to go through some sort of medical procedure, and has to follow some guidelines to decide which children should go through, for example, puberty blockers or
yes,
other things like that.
Of course, that is a matter of coming back regularly and see how a child is developing. And it's also depending on what we call the real life test. So if somebody wants to change sex, then it first has to act in the different sex in work, in social environment, in clothes, etc. And we don't have a test on size of brain structures or whatever at this moment that can be used to confirm that there is indeed a reversal of sex dysmorphy in the brain. So we can only depend on what people tell that they feel. And
Yes.
then it's also important, of course, to exclude that people have a condition in which you temporarily have the idea that you are somebody else, sometimes in different sex, like in schizophrenia or in bipolar disorders. Yeah.
So there's also a differential diagnosis that people have to make to properly identify someone who really has a case of having developed a different gender identity.
Yes, it includes many disciplines that look to this person.
Okay, so let me now ask you a specific question and then a more general one. So, with this knowledge that we have about the sexually dimorphic brain areas, what would you say can transgender people gain from this knowledge? I mean, in what ways can we apply this knowledge to help them?
Well, it has been applied, for instance, in England, and led to an acceptance of a law that made it possible to change sex in birth certificate and passport. And this knowledge is also used regularly in the European Court in Brussels for the same purpose. And I think that the most important thing is that you can explain the mechanisms, and that gives also acceptance, not only for the persons themselves, but also for society. So I think that this holds both for gender identity and for sexual orientation, that since we have found brain changes related to that, that it's more and more accepted all over the world. I'm also working in China, as you said.
Yeah.
And when I started some 20 years ago, it was forbidden for a boy and a girl to walk hand in hand over the street. And now, a few years ago, when I was giving a lecture about sexual differentiation of the brain, there were boys, students in the audience, and they were showing the rainbow flag. And I had to sign the flag, and I became honorary homosexual member of the movement in Hangzhou. So it's changing quickly in the world, and the acceptance is based at least partly on the fact that we can explain things.
Yes, that's really good to know. So, according to your experience, if we communicate this knowledge to people and let them know that it's not really the fault of these people that they have a different gender identity or sexual orientation, that's one of the things that make people more accepting of this kind of diversity.
Yes, and it makes also clear that you should not try to change those people, as is still done in America on some farms, where it's promised that people can change from homosexual to heterosexual, and the only effect is that it leads to high suicide rates. And in America it's forbidden, but still performed by some people. And in England, for instance, there are still psychiatrists who try to change homosexual men to heterosexual men. It's nonsense. And of course the same holds for transsexuality. It's programmed in the brain and you can't change it.
Yes, and unfortunately, I think that among trans people there is also a high rate of suicidality, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yes, and the same holds, of course, for homosexuality. It's because society has problems with this, because they don't belong to the majority of people, and therefore they are put under pressure. I think that knowledge is the only way to fight this.
Mhm. And this is a very important point to make here, I think, because sometimes right-wing commentators take on this knowledge and they distort the numbers a little bit in their favor to promote transphobic or homophobic political agendas, let's say, because in the case of suicidality, for example, it doesn't have anything to do with something that is operating wrong in those people's brains. It is really society that doesn't treat them correctly. Right.
Well, I don't know research to exclude that they also have a basis in vulnerability,
Okay.
which goes together with the condition. For homosexuality, there is some indication that the genetic background for homosexuality and for the vulnerability for suicide might overlap, at least partly. But it's usually the trigger is coming from society. So the vulnerability might be there, but the trigger is the society, the big problems they meet in society. And we should try to fight that.
Because they are discriminated against and ostracized sometimes and things like that, right?
Losing the job, not accepted by the family. So in Amsterdam, it appears that the sex change as such is a success in high rate, in let's say 98% or so. The problems they get is from not from the medical interference. The problems they get is from the family, from the job, from the neighbors, from society.
Yeah, society doesn't accept them. Okay, so just one last question. Do you know if there's any explanation as to why there seem to be many more male to female transsexuals than the reverse, that is, female to male transgenders or transsexuals?
Yeah, the female brain is the default. So if there is no testosterone, then you develop in female. And that means that in order to get a male brain, you should have testosterone and other factors in the right amount, in the right moment of development, on the right place in the brain, etc. So all those things might go wrong, and then you develop easily into the direction of female. So you need a lot of extra well-timed processes in order to develop into a male brain.
So female is the default in human development, could we say that?
Yes, and also in rodent development. So if there is no testicle, then they develop in females, even if they are genetically males.
Okay, Dr. Swaab, so I don't want to take any more of your time. It has been a great conversation and I think a very informative one, particularly nowadays where people are discussing a lot these issues and they are part of the political agenda in some places. So I think this is very important for people to know. Before we go, would you like to tell people if there are some places on the internet where they can find your work?
Yes, PubMed. Isn't it? Every publication in the medical and biological direction is published in PubMed. But I have also published for general public 2 books that might be of interest. Yeah. One is We Are Our Brains.
Yes.
That is published in English by Penguin. And the other one is Our Creative Brains, There is an e-book from that, and that can be obtained by the publisher.
Okay, so I will be leaving links to your work and also to these two books that you mentioned for the general public in the description box of the interview, so that people can go and buy them or check them out if they want. They are very interesting. Your work is very interesting indeed. So, Dr. Swaab, again,
For the book, it's good to say that they are translated. Our brains is translated in 17 languages, so there might be some languages that fits the person who is interested.
Okay, that's also good to know. So, Dr. Swaab, again, it was really my utmost pleasure to have you on the show, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
You're welcome.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've already been doing interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields for more than 2 years now. And I would really like to do it for 2 years more, or even more if I can, so I would really like to ask you to keep the channel sustainable, to please visit my Patreon page and to make a pledge there. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. You can also support me on PayPal. You can find all the links to it in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and supporters: Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Sergio Gondriano, Janne Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Vega Guidi, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arnaud Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Henrik Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Forrest Connolly, Drs. Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingart. My four producers, Isar Webbe, Rosie, Jim Frank, and Lucas Stafiniak. And finally, my executive producer, Michal Ruzieski. Thank you for all.